Great. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that session and the earlier session this morning, and will be with us over the rest of the today and tomorrow as well. As we've noted this morning, Europe has rolled out an incredibly large package to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, which is both a healthcare and a economic crisis. We heard from Commissioner Gentiloni this morning. We'll hear from the European Parliament in about an hour. But now let's turn our attention to the European Central Bank, which has been a leading institution in the constellation of European institutions for many years now, including and especially since the famous comments in the summer of 2015, where former President Mario Draghi said, we'll do whatever it takes. And since that, and even in the past year, the ECB has been incredibly aggressive and creative and imaginative, and just one of the leading lights across the continent. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Philip Lane, who joined the European Central Bank as a member of the executive board in 2019, replacing my good friend Peter Prate, who will be up next. He's responsible for the Directorate for General Economics, the Director for General Monetary Policy, and as all of you know, before joining the ECB, he was the governor of the Central Bank of Ireland, and for many years, a renowned economist, a long list of academic submissions. Dr. Lane, thank you for joining us here today. I know that you have a lot on your plate, so why don't we get to it? Just a few weeks ago, there was an assessment of the economic outlook that had a broad distribution ranging from severe to mild. Where do you think we are in that distribution, and what are you looking for to decide how severe this downturn may be?
So I don't want to say too much about the any update because we'll have our official projections next week. But across all of those scenarios, most of the variation is later on. The variation is essentially what will 2021 look like? Will the virus be contained? Will we have a second wave? How long will physical distancing measures be in place? And what will be the reaction of households which are saving a lot right now? What will be the reaction of investment? So I think that the range of scenarios, of course, there's variation this year. I think it's clear, by the way, that the absolute bottom was probably in April. So we have this paradox now that the European economy is probably growing a little bit now from the very bottom, but of course, it's so far below where it was that even a lot of recovery in these weeks and months will still mean that average output in 2020 will be in that range that we talked about. So, I think it's the unknowns are later on. We know we're deeply below where we should be right now. And I think it's too early to tell in terms of the speed and the extent of the recovery.
Wonderful. And you see the individual countries, are there convergence, divergence? How much distribution is there among and between the members?
Well, I think the best guide to that is the European Commission spring forecast that came out, where they have a lot of country detail in addition to their EU level forecasts. And maybe, in the grand scheme of things, the common component is dominating. It's a big shock for everyone. And around that, really the two forces determining the range are, number one is those countries which are unlucky enough to be hit first and more severely in terms of the virus, such as Italy, and then the structure of output. So, of course, when we think about those economies, for example, with a lot of tourism, tourism is obviously going to take a big hit this year. So, there is variation. But I think it's variation around a very negative mean. Variation is still interesting, but I think it's really dominated by the overall aggregate picture. So if you like, in terms of what's interesting about that is it makes, as you mentioned, the policy response being quite aggressive. But of course, when there's a common shock, the case for the European institutions and the case for the ECB to respond is obvious when there's a common shock. Whereas when you have where the mean is okay, that's much more problematic in terms of managing macro policy. Whereas when it's a common shock, the power of a common central bank, the power of the joint EU institutions comes into play much more forcefully.
One of the cornerstones of the measures that you have taken is the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, the PEPP. And you said in your blog just a few weeks ago, we'll adjust instruments as warranted. This includes increasing its size and adjusting its composition as much as necessary for as long as needed. I guess your own version of whatever it takes. How do you judge this program, and what are you looking for to possibly make changes to it in the future?
So really, there's really two broad roles for the PEP. And in the same way, I think for every central bank, the central monetary policy is playing two roles at the moment. One is, given the big recessionary impulse, you want an accommodative monetary policy. So and obviously as central banks have brought the policy rate somewhere in the neighborhood of the lower bound, then at the margin, most of the monetary accommodation is going to come from asset purchases. So that's part of it. It's just to add monetary accommodation in order to keep inflation on a reasonable trajectory towards its medium-term aim. And then the second is market stabilization. And because what we saw in those that middle part of March was a lot of market pressure. And again, that was global in many ways. We also had it in the dollar market. And so, I think that was needed as well. And the flexibility comes in terms of course, with a kind of interesting financial system in Europe. It's not as unified as the US financial system. Then, of course, when you have a single currency, when the capacity of investors to substitute quite easily across different geographies is there, then one dimension of flexibility is geographical. Another is between sovereign and corporate, because there was also strains in the corporate bond market and the commercial paper market. So one of the innovations for the ECB was to enter the commercial paper market. So, I think it's the design of PEP, it turns out, has been helpful to have this kind of single pot where the use of that pot can be reallocated in a very general way, depending on the kind of strains that are evident. And of course, the announcement effect was quite powerful. There were questions in the first half of March about essentially what would be the role of the ECB under these conditions. And the design of a flexible program provided very quickly a lot of reassurance that, just like every other central bank in the world, we know we cannot deliver price stability if we have markets that are basically unstable. So it's a precondition for our primary mandate to make sure that markets are able to operate in a kind of a stable manner without worrying about tail events, such as loss of liquidity and so on.
I know the semi-annual financial stability report will be out maybe just in a few minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah, so I won't ask you to front run that, but do you feel comfortable with the market fragility that we saw earlier? Do you feel that that's become quiescent, sufficient, such that you can focus on other aspects? Are you comforted by where you are?
So clearly, there's been a significant recovery from the intense strains that were there in the second week of March. So from that perspective, it is a lot more stable than then. But I think anyone who's looking at the world economy, anyone looking at the high level of uncertainty in relation to the severity and duration of the challenges in containing the virus, means financial stability reports focus on what-if scenarios. They don't, in our monetary policy, we have a central projection. Of course, we look at the downside as well. But the tails, obviously, there's elevated tail risk everywhere at the moment. So, all dimensions of central banks, the monetary policy, the kind of financial stability assessment, everyone is hyper-focused now on those different dimensions.
As you know, global debt levels are at a historic level. our own global debt monitor just out recently noted that 232% of GDP and rising. The OECD just came out with their report a few days ago, which was headline grabbing, 17 trillion in additional debt for the OECD countries. But many economists have said that debt doesn't matter now. We should be doing whatever it takes in order to restore growth. How do you see the debt debate? Does debt matter? And are you worried about the excessive levels of debt that we saw occurring even pre-crisis?
Yeah, you worked in that phrase, excessive level of debt, at the end of your. So the big question is, even going back over the last decade, under the counterfactual where the same amount of debt were not issued. So of course we can always lament why don't we have financial systems and wider institutional frameworks which promote equity financing. But in the absence of kind of removing the bias towards debt that does exist, in many places, to me the interesting question is: would the world be more stable? Would the world look better without all of this debt have been issued? Because it was, I think we have to take that kind of macro view. Is, of course, you can come up with excessive debt scenarios. You can come up with a misgoverned bank. You come up with a badly run country. You can come up with all sorts of scenarios which do lead to excessive debt. But you also have to take the other view, which is, as right now, I think there's as you say, the economic consensus is there needs to be an aggressive fiscal response to the current situation. But I would join in the view, I think, of everyone who looks at this, which is okay, and also not to lose one's nerve too quickly about the role of public debt, but also to appreciate that life can change. The interest rate environment can change. So the previous episodes of low interest rates, quite often it was not predicted that there would be a reversal in that situation. So reversals can happen. So we do have to, I think, allow for that. And I think everyone involved, national governments, investors, everyone does have to recognize that it's, I think there's good cases or good narratives which will keep interest rates quite low for a long time. But there are kind of scenarios where that goes into reverse. Now, by the way, there is a kind of, you also have to keep track of some reasons why interest rates may go up would be good news stories, because essentially the world economy is growing more quickly. There's rising investment demand and so on. There's other good news stories where people get less scared, so the amount of precautionary savings goes down. So, I don't think the level of the interest rate is a unique indicator. You always have to assess that. And in the same way with the debt situation, you do have to assess the configuration. So by and large, in many economies now, we entered this crisis with current account balances, much smaller than they used to be. Okay, within Europe, there's individual countries with big surpluses, but we don't have a group of large deficit economies. Compared to world GDP, the large deficit economy is the US, but we don't have that combination of a twin debt or twin deficit of a high fiscal deficit and a high current account deficit. And when the debt is internal, so if you think of the euro area, from a currency point of view, what matters is euro area. If the surge in public debt is essentially matched by a surge in household savings, then the debt servicing is an internal transfer. It's not a macro leak problem, which you would have if you had the traditional emerging market crisis where you were making payments to foreign investors. When it's an internal transfer, and this is why Japan, of course, has been able to manage very high debt for a long time, that the macro dynamic is totally different. It's still very interesting from a public finance point of view, but the macro dynamic is totally different than a situation where there's an external gap to be closed.
Dr. Lean, one question from the audience is the following. How does the ECB make governments accountable for the support they are given? Is it a free lunch? So a question of conditionality.
So You made reference to Mario Draghi's 2012, whatever it takes. It's very important to appreciate that statement came after the agreement about the fiscal compact in Europe. So essentially, in the European context, the major fiscal discipline is coming through the European framework, which has the European Commission, it has the Eurogroup, it has national fiscal frameworks. And, if you look at the history of the last 10 years, there's a lot of debate about the exact design of that fiscal framework. But by and large, I think there's been a lot of fiscal discipline in Europe. And, I think having that European framework means that the ECB can focus on monetary policy, knowing that there is a European framework to enforce, if you like, official sector discipline. And of course, we also have in the European context market discipline. We don't do monetary financing, and we have a lot of safeguards against that. So it's not the case. I think it's not the case that we are somehow, subordinated to national governments. And with this shock, I think many central bankers have made this point. What's going on right now is such a massive shock. It's obvious there should be easy fiscal policy. It's obvious there should be accommodative monetary policy. But that does not mean there's some kind of fiscal dominance or coordination. It's just a shock. It calls for both policies to be quite accommodative.
Winston Churchill once said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." And I think you mentioned Mario Draghi. He was at Jackson Hole several years ago, and he said, "Look, we'll do whatever it takes as a bridging, and it's a bridging, but we also need structural reform." Is this an opportune time in this crisis to talk about structural reform and as a Green New Deal? Or pick your deal, but is it now an opportunity to do the structural reform that we've heard about for many years?
Well, let me first of all remind everyone that probably there have been pretty big reforms where the value is now paying off. So the single supervisory mechanism, having a banking union, having a single supervisor, and then more broadly across Europe, which with the EBA and so on, for example, has allowed a pretty big supervisory response. And that supervisory response, I think, is quite important in ensuring that the credit system can remain quite stable. We have the ESM. So, of course, there's a lot of debate about the exact design of the precautionary credit line. But I think that's been important. Again, having the European Stability Mechanism is very important in managing fiscal tail risk. So we do have already the value of these institutions kicking in. But, I suppose the question is what's next and what is more. And then what we've seen is two phases now. We have the initial response to the crisis in terms of the EIB program. I've mentioned the ESM and then the SURE program, all of which are helpful and valuable. And now the kind of immediate issue is the design of a recovery fund. So all of this is showing that on top of the baseline in the European Union of national fiscal responses, and a lot can remain possible at the national level, we are seeing more and more different versions of a degree more European fiscal union, which again, it's always been the case that the narrative is for small shocks, national fiscal policy can handle it. You can borrow and lend over the cycle. You can use the automatic stabilizers. But for large shocks, there's a special value to containing the tail risk through joint action. And we're seeing a lot of it right now. And then, I think it is, as you say, until the situation presents itself and kind of say what exactly is needed, it's always hard to kind of predict in advance how much is going to happen. But we're seeing quite a lot happen this year.
You mentioned the recovery program, the Franco-German announcement last week. This still has to run through the bureaucracy, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament. But is that a game changer? And does it change the way that you think about the trajectory of monetary policy, the shape and trajectory of monetary policy over the next 6 months?
We welcome. There's no doubt. And you saw what happened in financial conditions last week after the announcement. So we welcome it. Obviously it requires the ongoing negotiation at the European Council and the different formats. But it goes back to one thing more generally. I think we're finding this year, not just in Europe but globally, is, if you like, in this low interest rate world, the ability to capitalize. So it's a relatively small amount of annual extra, budget in the European Union context, with low interest rates can capitalize on quite a lot of support. Right. So, that's essentially, I think, the big event this year is that essentially the low interest rate world opens many doors. It does open many doors, and that's just one example. Of course, it's by design. It's specific to the crisis. It's relatively contained in terms of size. So, at that level, it's very much a kind of specific response, which I think, of course, is much more likely at this point to gain a lot of consensus than some grand announcement of a permanent move to fiscal union.
Another question from the audience. Apparently in a speech today, the governor of the Bank of France, I didn't see the speech, but I'm taking this for its word.
That's nice.
He said that he would like to see an increase in the PEPP only if the ECB did not cling to the capital key. Do you have a view about that?
Well, I mean, we still have just over a week before the monetary policy meeting, so we're still forming our own views and so on. But it goes back. I think the basic point with the design of the PEP is the benchmark is the capital key. That's very important that we have a benchmark, which essentially means that monetary policy is operating across the whole euro area. Because, of course, different population sizes and so on. But equally, we did say with the flexibility, that as needed, we can depart from that benchmark. And I think Francois is basically making that point, is that the whole point of having flexibility is, if it's needed, is you can deviate from the capital key. We're already doing it. I think, how much we need to do depends on the state of the amount of market stress we see. So, I think it's very much a state contingent issue. But the message I think we try to convey in the announcement of PEP is we're essentially goal orientated. We want to deliver an effective monetary policy. We want a transmission mechanism that works smoothly. And depending on the market stress that we face, having the flexibility to move away from capital key is a very important principle of the PEP program. And, I think it does improve the efficiency of monetary policy, which is, I think, the basic point he was making in those remarks last night.
In a recent FSB report to the G20, we saw that Chairman Randy Quarles noted that globally there's been over 800 different policy programs. Obviously, central banks around the world have been central to the recovery and response. How do you gauge or judge international cooperation among you and your counterparts at other central banks? Is there anything missing, something you'd like to see different in the future?
So, I'm not so sure that the current situation is, if you like, the kind of best test case for cooperation. Because going back, it's a common shock, it's global, it's obvious everyone should be adopting accommodative policy. And if you like, again, the fact that so many emerging markets in the last 15 years or so have, for example, have now got an operational local currency sovereign debt market, which is allowing them to have more flexibility in how they conduct policy to a degree. It is quantitatively relevant now that emerging markets are able to do easing, and there's positive spillovers for us. So I think it's good news that essentially there's enough development in the emerging market financial systems, their monetary policy frameworks, that they are able to contribute to monetary easing. I think a lot has been learned from the last crisis. So maybe some initiatives that took some effort last time can kind of kick into place pretty quickly now. So, for example, swap lines, repo lines, all of that, is happening. More will happen, I'm sure. So at that kind of mechanical level of cooperation, the playbook has been written already. And then in terms of all of because it's global shock, I think we're all interested in learning from each other in terms of the state of our respective economies, and also, if you like, in terms of what works or what doesn't work with all of this policy experimentation. So through all sorts of, official fora, through all sorts of bilateral networks, even though, of course, it's, this kind of remote online world is the world we live in for central bank cooperation these days. I think there's a lot of shared effort.
And as you look across the global landscape, are there particular parts of the global economy that cause you concern? Do you have an assessment about the U.S. economy or the Chinese economy? Are there parts of the global economy are there bright spots where you could take some solace?
Well, the timing of how the virus moved around the world means we do benefit, and I'm sure the public health officials are also benefiting from learning as much as possible from China and the other Asian economies. So in the same way that you do see a significant recovery in the Chinese economy now, but incomplete, that does tell you at one level there is a pathway out of this, but the fact it's incomplete means also we know that until all parts of the world economy are back on track, it does mean no part of the world economy can completely recover. So that interdependence is fundamental, but I think it's also, in terms of learning, the fact that we do see this visible recovery in China is I think very important. Beyond that, I think there's lots of institutional differences in how the financial system works, how the social safety net works. That I think. Like for like comparisons that works, are not so easy. But I think what's important is, as far as possible, in as many parts of the world economy as possible, the policy response is there. Yes, central banks, but central banks honestly are relatively minor compared to the fiscal responses.
We're just about out of time. Let me just close out with two questions that came in from the audience. One is, with production costs rising due to health, worker safety, and logistical issues, would we see prices rising as well? That's question one. And two, as you could expect, a question about the German Constitutional Court and how the ECB is currently viewing that court decision.
Okay, so I think on inflation and pricing, we see a little bit of inflation in things like food, because of course, but more broadly, I can imagine many firms who do face more costs. But of course, simultaneously, they face a much smaller customer base. The demand levels have gone down. And, the pricing strategy by which you try and get the customer to swallow a higher price, probably compressed profit margins are going to be much more likely. So, we don't rule out individual sectors seeing price increases. We're sufficiently humble about the longer term inflation outlook, but I think most of the weight has to be on a lot of slack, a lot of compressed demand. So mostly, I think this is a negative period for the inflation path. And on the German court, on the day of the announcement, we took note of it in our press release, and just reminded everyone that we are undeterred in our pursuit of our monetary policy.
Yeah, that sounds great. That's a great way to end this conversation. Dr. Lane, thank you so much. We wish you all the best, and we greatly appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.